Late August 1944. The sun was still high over a dusty compound in rural Oklahoma when a truck carrying newly arrived prisoners rolled slowly through the front gate. Inside the truck sat 20 exhausted German soldiers. Most had been captured weeks earlier during the collapse of German defenses in France after the Allied breakout from Normandy. Now, after crossing the Atlantic under heavy guard, they had arrived somewhere in the middle of the United States, a country many of them had only heard about through propaganda. None of them knew exactly what to expect. Among the prisoners was a 24-year-old infantryman named Karl Fischer. Karl had spent the past 2 years fighting across Europe. He had marched through villages in Poland, endured freezing nights in Russia, and survived Allied bombings in France. But nothing about his wartime experiences had prepared him for what he was about to see. The truck stopped beside a low wooden building near the center of the camp. An American sergeant climbed onto the back step. "All right," he said calmly, motioning with his hand. "Everybody out." The prisoners climbed down slowly, blinking in the bright sunlight. The camp was larger than Karl expected. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the open ground. A tall fence surrounded the entire area, guarded by towers where American soldiers watched quietly. It looked orderly, clean, not the brutal prison compound many of the men had imagined. But what happened next confused them even more. The sergeant led the group toward a long building with wide windows. Above the door hung a simple sign. Karl exchanged a glance with another soldier beside him. "Why would prisoners need a canteen?" the man whispered. Inside, the building looked strangely familiar, almost like a small shop. Shelves lined the walls. Behind a wooden counter stood an American corporal who looked barely older than the prisoners themselves. The German soldiers stared. On the shelf were dozens of items they had not seen in years. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, packets of chewing gum, brightly colored bottles filled with dark liquid. The corporal spoke through an interpreter. "You can buy things here," he explained. "When you start working, you earn camp wages." The prisoners looked confused. "Buy things? Inside a prison camp?" Karl stepped closer to the counter, drawn toward the bottles. He picked one up carefully. The glass felt cold. He had heard the name once before the war, but he had never tasted it. The corporal noticed his curiosity. "First time?" the guard asked with a slight grin. Karl nodded cautiously. The guard shrugged. 5 cents. Karl stared at him. 5 cents. The interpreter repeated the number in German. Karl slowly set the bottle down. He had no money. None of them did. But what surprised him most was not the drink itself. It was the fact that something like this even existed inside a camp holding enemy soldiers. Over the next few days, the prisoners settled into camp routine. They were assigned to barracks, given uniforms marked clearly with the letters PW. Each morning, they lined up for roll call before being sent to work details. Some repaired roads. Others harvested crops on nearby farms. Karl was assigned to a warehouse team, unloading food shipments that arrived weekly by rail. That was where he saw the first sign that something about this country was different. The freight cars seemed endless. Crates filled with flour, boxes of canned vegetables, barrels of cooking oil, and entire pallets of bottled drinks. Karl watched American workers unload the cargo with mechanical forklifts. One worker laughed as he wiped sweat from his face. "Another shipment already," the man said. Karl tried to estimate the amount of food in just that single delivery. It was more than the entire regiment had received during some months on the Eastern Front. Yet here it seemed routine. The supplies weren't being rushed to soldiers at the front. They were simply going to military bases and prison camps. One afternoon, after several weeks of labor, Carl finally received his first camp pay. 80 cents. The interpreter explained the system. The money wasn't real American currency. It was special camp scrip that could only be used inside the compound. But the purchasing power still surprised the prisoners. Carl returned to the canteen that evening. The same corporal stood behind the counter. Carl placed a small stack of coins on the wooden surface. "1 bottle," he said in careful English. The guard reached into an ice-filled cooler and pulled out a glass bottle. Drops of condensation rolled down the side. Carl opened it slowly. The sound startled him. A sharp hiss of carbonation escaped from the bottle. He took a cautious sip. The taste was unlike anything he had experienced before. Sweet, cold, sparkling. For a moment, he simply stared at the bottle in disbelief. Back home in Germany, sugar had been rationed for years. Even simple sweets were difficult to find. But here, prisoners could buy a sweet drink with a single coin. It was a small thing. Yet it raised a question none of the men could answer. If this was how the enemy treated prisoners, what was life like for ordinary Americans? The biggest surprise came the following month. It was early September, and the Oklahoma heat still hung heavy over the camp. After dinner one evening, the guards wheeled several metal carts into the mess hall. The prisoners watched curiously. Each cart carried large metal containers packed in crushed ice. One of the American cooks lifted the lid. Inside was something the German soldiers had not seen in years. Ice cream. Not a small amount. Buckets of it. Chocolate. Vanilla. Strawberry. The interpreter spoke again. "Tonight dessert," he said simply. The room fell silent. Carl glanced down the long tables. Many of the older soldiers looked stunned. Ice cream had practically disappeared from Germany long before the war reached its later years. Milk, sugar, and refrigeration were scarce. Even children rarely saw frozen desserts anymore. Yet here it was, served casually in a prison camp. An American cook walked down the rows, scooping portions into metal bowls. When Carl received his serving, he hesitated. The spoon sank easily into the soft frozen cream. He tasted it slowly. The sweetness spread instantly across his tongue. For a brief moment, the noise of the mess hall faded. He was no longer a prisoner in Oklahoma. He was a child again, standing in a small shop in Munich before the war, holding a cone his father had bought during a summer afternoon. Around him, other prisoners were reacting the same way. Some laughed quietly. Others simply shook their heads. One older sergeant muttered something under his breath. "This makes no sense," he said. Carl understood what he meant. According to everything they had been told for years, America was supposed to be weak, decadent, disorganized. Yet the evidence sitting in their bowls suggested something very different. A country capable of producing luxuries, even while fighting a massive global war. Over the following months, Carl and the other prisoners noticed more examples. Work crews sometimes passed roadside diners, where American families ate meals together. Children rode bicycles with bottles of soda tucked into their baskets. Local grocery stores displayed entire aisles of packaged food. Even with rationing in place, the shelves still seemed full. One evening, Carl spoke quietly with an American guard named Miller while unloading crates. Miller pointed toward the boxes. "Milk delivery," he said. Carl looked at the labels. Hundreds of bottles. "Every day?" Carl asked. Miller nodded. "Pretty much." Carl tried to imagine the logistics required. millions of soldiers deployed overseas, factories producing tanks and aircraft around the clock. Yet farms and food production still seemed abundant enough to support everything else. It challenged assumptions he had carried since the beginning of the war. Winter arrived, and the camp routine continued. The prisoners worked, ate, and waited for news from Europe. But the small moments stayed with them. The cold bottles of soda, the unexpected desserts, the casual abundance that seemed normal to the Americans around them. Carl began writing letters to his family. The censors read every word, of course, but he still tried to describe what he had seen. He wrote about the farms, the trains, the factories, and the strange experience of drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola while sitting behind barbed wire. Months later, when the war in Europe finally ended, many of the prisoners returned to Germany. Carl was among them. The journey home was difficult. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared under Allied bombing. But Carl carried a memory that many others shared. Not just of defeat, but of a realization that had begun quietly inside a remote American camp. The realization that the strength of a nation might not come only from armies or weapons. Sometimes it came from something much simpler. Factories that could produce enormous quantities of everyday goods. Farms that fed entire populations. And a society wealthy enough that even enemy prisoners could buy a cold drink for a few coins. Years later, when West Germany rebuilt its economy, some former prisoners would remember those strange moments in American camps. The taste of soda, the surprise of ice cream on a hot evening. Small things, yet powerful reminders of a world far larger and far more productive than they had once believed possible. And for many of them, the memory never faded. The day they realized that even behind barbed wire, the war had already revealed something unexpected. Not just who would win the conflict, but which system could create a future filled with abundance.